I wish it need not have happened in my lifetime. So do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. J.R.R. Tolkien, The Fellowship of the Ring. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. Rami Amathan is here too. Guys, I've said on this show before that Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien reads like the Bible, and I didn't mean it in a good way, like Rams. I meant it like...
Sounds like you're
the writing is stuffy and old-fashioned, like a bit out of date. But the quote that I just read feels like God himself wrote it, which is fitting because it's a
even
conversation
further
between...
insulting
Please.
than just being the Bible.
Well, it's a conversation between Frodo and Gandalf, which is
Okay.
pretty fitting because Gandalf is, as I understand it, sort of a god or like an angel or something. Please,
right.
Lord of the Rings fans, don't come at me. I'm not going to read the Silmarillion. Anyways, let me read this quote to you again. Just let it wash over you. I wish it need not have happened in my lifetime. So do I, and so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us.
Chills.
And
Absolute chills.
Right.
Yeah.
And what I'm choosing to do with my time is having on Red Széll, who's our newest regular contributor on AMI Audiobook Review. You might know him from his show on AMI Audio, My Life in Books, fellow book broadcaster joining us from London, UK. How's it going, Red?
Very well. How are you, Jacob?
Doing all right. We've
Hi, Rami.
spoken
Hi.
many times on off the record recordings. I listen to your show very regularly. I don't know if you listen to ours, but you should.
Yeah.
But it's a natural marriage. Every time we talk, I always love the conversations we end up having. Where do you want to start? I think we should talk about your show because it'll give us an idea of who you are and what you're all about. So, like, what's the concept of your show?
Well, look, I think what all three of us have in common is that we all love books, and the audiobooks have given us a way to enjoy those books without having to read them slowly in Braille or just be denied them entirely. In my case, I wouldn't be able to even see the page anymore. So for me, it's kind of been a rebirth of that love of books that I had from the moment I started reading. It's always been my favourite solitary activity to curl up with a book and just step into another world. And it doesn't necessarily have to be fiction. It can be non-fiction. It can be anything. I love stepping out of the daily grind and just going somewhere else.
Why a book and not a podcast? Or we're going to talk crime in a second, but I was recently pondering over this. There's so much true crime out there. True crime podcast, true crime TV series, everything under the sun is available in true crime. But there's something different about picking up a book and settling, as you say, settling right into that world, or just investing a whole bunch of time in an author's way of a true crime unfolding versus something else like the podcast realm or the video.
Look, I think, and we're podcasters ourselves, but
Yeah.
I think there's something a bit didactic about podcasts. You are seeing the world or the subject through somebody else's point of view with their production values put on top of it, with their music put on top of it. There's something about a book where it's quite pure. You're stepping into an author's world, their perception of that world, but you're doing it with your own eyes or your own ears, without the bells and whistles there to sort of direct your attention in some way or another. And it's kind of a consensual engagement between the two of you as far as a book is concerned. Whereas a podcast usually has guests, it usually has a presenter, and it feels like a production that has a company behind it.
True.
Well, you say that like podcasts are didactic, meaning
They
like
can
in
be,
this world, kind of they're meta, right? They have a perspective, but when a book is well written, yes, it is that author's perspective of their own world, but when it's written, it doesn't feel like the author's perspective matters. It feels like it just exists in and of itself, as if an author birthed an entire world that's beyond the author themselves. Do you know what I mean? Like it has a life of its own that's like separated from the author.
I think it's far more of a dance between you and the author.
Yep.
Rather than a kind of organized rave, which is what sometimes a podcast can feel a little bit like, especially the true crime ones where you get all these experts and everybody's kind of like hammering away at their own point. And I just honestly find them a little bit wearing. I was never a huge fan of television, even when I could see. And I find podcasts.
What a hot take.
I know.
First of all.
It's all right. You know, we're all
TV,
entitled to our own opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
but I find a lot of podcasts have just gone a little bit too TV-like for my own liking. And, you know, I suppose it could be leveled at me that my life in books is very much a radio show that has become a podcast.
Well, it's old school.
Yeah.
Right? It's old school. It's you and an author talking for an hour. But I think the format of that show is what does it. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's slow radio. It's a deep dive into an author's work and their motivations, their key themes, what, you know, really makes them tick. So we start off by talking about their latest publication, do a pretty deep dive into that. I'll always have read the book. Why would you have an author onto the show if you haven't read their book? And we'll talk about the main characters, some of the plot, obviously without giving spoilers, just to whet people's appetites as to what the book is about. We always begin the show with a 2-minute clip of the audiobook, just to get a flavour of the strength of the author's writing. And from having talked about the plot and the main characters a bit, we branch out into the major themes that run through that book. And just dig a little bit deeper, find out what motivated the author to pick up the pen on that particular story. And as I say, it can be fiction or non-fiction. And then from that, we branch out into their work in general. So the major themes that link all their work. And you know, sometimes we go into how they write. Sometimes we go into the research that they've done for their books. I try and share the author's life with the listeners, because I know a lot of our listeners actually would like to write their own books, and sometimes it's good to pick up tips from those who've got published works. Then we obviously focus on the audiobook version of the book. We'll talk a little bit about the narrator, the selection of the narrator, sometimes about the style of the narration. Sometimes there'll be more than one narrator who'll have read the book, and you can talk about why that has been the case. I tend to stay away from books that have been dramatized as audiobooks. I always feel that's a little bit too close to radio shows, but we've gone there as well. And then I finish up with my favorite part of the show, the Books of Your Life section, where I ask my guest to nominate 3 books that have resonated with them through their life. First, a book that they read as a youngster that made them fall in love with reading or want to become an author. Then a book they'd like to curl up with and reread on a rainy day. And finally, a book they've read recently that they'd like to share with the listeners.
Red, can I steal that idea right now and put you on the spot? What are your 3 books of your life?
The book that I read as a youngster that made me want to write was Sleeping Murder by Agatha Christie, which was only
Naturally.
published in 1976 when I was 6.5 years old. But she wrote it during the Second World War, and it's Miss Marple's Last Case, and it is a fabulous psychological thriller. It made me realize that you could play with the reader's mind as an author, and it sent shivers up my spine. The book that I'd like to curl up with and reread on a rainy day is by Louis de Bernier, and it's called Notwithstanding, and it's a collection of short stories by the author of Captain Corelli's Mandolin, and they're set on the Surrey-Sussex border in the south of England, in actually the next village along from where I grew up. Notwithstanding is a fictional version of a place called Whitley. And they're just lovely character sketches of eccentric characters in the English countryside and a way of life that, well, has passed now. It's their stories gathered from the 70s, 80s and 90s. And it's when I was growing up there, it was very, very rural. You know, you could cycle down all these lovely country paths without being taken out by some idiot in a 4x4 coming to his holiday home for the weekend.
What a dream.
And finally, the book that I've read recently that I'm shouting from the rooftops about, and if you haven't read it, it is beautiful, is a book I've actually featured on My Life in Books, and it's called Falling Animals by Sheila Armstrong. It's set on the west coast of Ireland, and it's about the effect of an unexplained death within a small seaside community. I'm not going to say too much more. It's not a murder story, but it is an unexplained death. But it tells the story from a dozen different points of view, and it shows what the reaction within the community is, and how everybody is slightly changed by what's happened. And I think it really reflects life in the 21st century. And it is also narrated by Aoife McMahon, who is one of my favourite narrators of all time. And again, there's an episode in which I interview her about being a narrator, and it's just ear candy, really. So, blowing my own trumpet for my show, but it is a beautiful, beautiful episode.
The book Falling Animals, when you say a dozen perspectives, are you being literal?
Yeah, basically,
Oh,
it takes Aoife is such a good narrator that she can do every single one of the voices in a way that you feel is authentic. But I mean, she's not caricaturing them, but they just sound like different voices.
It's also that you can tell that the voice is different based on the writing. Like the writing itself has very good character voice. And what's the name of the author again? Can you remind me?
Sheila Armstrong.
Sheila Armstrong. I actually did read this book at your recommendation, Red, and it was really good. It's basically, Ramya, there are like 12 or so perspectives, but every chapter is one perspective and never goes back to a perspective that's already been explored.
Okay.
And every perspective kind of has like a cameo of the previous one. And so they're all loosely connected in a way that kind of comes roundabout, and it's very thematically complete. Really good recommendation.
Well, you know I'm hooked. Like, I'm ready
I
for
think
this.
you would like it. I think
Yeah.
you would like it. It's very literary. It's very beautifully written.
Yeah, I mean, so far only one person I've recommended it to didn't particularly like it, and that was my dad. And he and I have diametrically opposite
Yeah.
book.
What does he like?
Loves. He's a little bit more non-fiction than fiction, although I am winning him round to detective fiction. Finally, after all these years of me saying, Dad, you've got to read this, you've got to read that, he is finally, he's joined the murder book club. And so he's a work in progress. Yes, my enthusiasm is clearly rubbing off.
Okay.
When you're interviewing authors, I'm really curious, do you find that they have a type, like commonalities that they all seem to have, stereotypes, if you want to call it that?
I think all authors love stepping into their creative world. And with the authors of fiction, they enjoy the company of the characters that they're writing around. I don't want to sort of belittle, but it's a little bit as if they are in charge of the doll's house and they can, or the theatre, and they can move all the characters around, and they enjoy the company of the characters. Actually, yeah, the doll's house is probably a wrong way of putting it. It's a theatre. It's like being the theatre director for them. For the non-fiction authors, I think what they enjoy corralling the research that they do and organizing that into a really good digestible way. So rather than sometimes they're dealing with characters, but more it's they're dealing with themes in the same way that fiction authors are dealing with characters. But yes, it's an enjoyment of stepping into the world that they're creating.
I can picture that type of person being, at least from an outside perspective, seeming quite aloof. Somebody who's very introspective and putting that creativity into something that they're personally very absorbed in. It's not strictly just to create a product to sell. It's to absorb yourself into it, because not just because they like writing, but because they just enjoy being in a world that they created. Am I off base?
No, I think you're correct. I mean,
I totally get that. I totally understand that.
I mean, the reason I always read the book, apart from, or as many books as I can that they've published, it's not simply and solely a respect of the author thing. I mean, obviously, it would be very disrespectful not to read their books. But the reason I want to read their books is because I feel I have to step into their world. I can't really expect them to leap into the world of Red Széll's My Life in Books and feel comfortable with it. I need to step into their world and understand their world to be able to interview them properly, and I think that's what puts them at their ease. There you go, I'm sharing all my secrets.
We'll have
droves of people applying for my job, and I'll be out of work next week.
By people, you mean AI, right?
Damn.
And it is kind of a touchy subject when you're talking to creators of any kind, artists, authors, etc., because you immerse yourself into their work, but you have your honest interpretations or ratings or just the way that you've taken in that thing. But you almost not necessarily want your biases to color the way that they would express their world and the creation of their art, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm never dogmatic in my interpretation of their book, but I will quite often turn around and say, I got the impression that you were hinting at this.
What do you mean by dogmatic in your interpretation?
Well, I never turn around and say, now you wrote about this in this way because you want us to think that. I mean,
Assuming you know. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
I guess we were all in those literature lessons, English literature lessons at school, where your teacher turned around and went, "There is no such thing as the author having a message," and that's always really stuck with me. You can interpret what they're trying to say and why they're trying to say it. But, I was interviewing David Bergen a couple of weeks ago, fantastic author, the Canadian author. And I just said, look, I went all the way through your book, Away from the Dead, thinking that you'd chosen the title for this reason. And he went, I've never thought of that, but I actually quite like your interpretation.
I love that.
Maybe subconsciously I was. Now, in his spare time, he's a literature professor. And as he said, this is the way that his book continues to live after he's written it. That the reader's interpretation gives the book oxygen.
I love that. It's really, I guess, refreshing to know that people do enjoy or could enjoy, and we see it across platforms as well, right? The availability of talking directly to authors, to narrators, and really getting into it, like the fandom of it. But with literature, it's nice to also know that the depth of our interpretations isn't offensive or hurtful. Sometimes I think you can get pretty personal,
Yeah, I mean, people like to be a little bit more black and white about things nowadays, don't they? I mean, you get more hits on whichever social media platform you're on if you stick your neck out and say something that is either positive or negative, or controversial or not controversial.
Some sort of extreme interpretation, like Harry Potter is a communist retelling of Stalinist Russia or something.
Yeah. Exactly, and I can't be doing with that.
That would get clicks though.
Other people can waste their time doing that. I would quite happily just.
He said, "What did you call it? Like slowed down radio?"
Slow radio. Yeah.
Slow radio.
Slow radio.
Yeah.
And you can always get a reaction out of somebody by throwing out a comment at them, but I prefer to tease out an interpretation, or as I say, it's a dance. It's not pogoing.
I can only imagine that for authors, I'm sure most of them, I'd like to hear your perspective on this, Red, that most of them have an interpretation or a message or a theme in mind when they're writing, because they definitely have opinions. They have things that they want to say. Like, what author is writing and saying, I don't know what I'm saying, but it's up to the reader to interpret?
Oh, absolutely. They are all exploring some themes, and as I say, that's what I'm trying to tease out. Look, like we were talking about with podcasts earlier, the worst podcasts tell you what they are setting out to do in the first sentence, and then rather self-congratulatorily at the end pat themselves on the back and say, we've just told you. And it's the same with books. If you get a book that says, I'm setting out to do this, and you've got 400 pages of them actually demonstrating how damn clever they
it
are.
sounds like you're talking smack about self-development, because
I was just
heard
going to say, that is
Jacob.
every single
I knew
nonfiction, like self-help book.
He's going to go on a roll now, because Jacob has talked about how self-development, or like the themes of self-improvement, don't have to be in nonfiction. He sent me an entire video interpreting this. It was like 8 minutes, and how you could better bring it up in a fantasy fiction novel than to be so literal in self-development. Oh my.
It does show a certain lack of imagination, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Let the reader come to their own conclusions of how to better themselves in reading a
Sometimes
fiction
we're just looking for
book.
an instruction manual. Come on.
Instruction manuals don't tell you why something works, though, necessarily. It doesn't internalize. At least
I mean, we
to
should
me,
assume it does work.
this
That
is
it
why
comes with the buy-in.
Okay, that's a good point. That's fair.
Self-discovery actually does argue that there should be a degree of discovery rather than just being hit over the head with the same message again and again and again. You know, I certainly, you know, with my kids, I've noticed that the things that have stuck with them most are the things that you help them to discover themselves rather than the things you tell them.
It's a teaching method. It's
Yes,
guided
yes,
discovery. It's
It's a
showing
school of
people the
thought.
context and then having people discover the answer on their own instead of slapping them in the face with the answer, often
Interesting.
very aggressively and poorly written with too many adverbs.
This this part feels like a great part 2 of our censorship chat from last episode. Okay, Red, tell us what's to come on the next episode of My Life in Books, please.
Okay, the latest episode of My Life in Books is an interview with Tara Ray Moss, who some people may know from her former incarnation as a model in the 1990s. She's a Canadian-Australian crime writer who is an international bestseller, and her latest series featuring her stylish, fast-talking, fast-driving, champagne-drinking, glamorous detective Billy Walker is set in Sydney, Australia, in the late 1940s. Billy was a war correspondent during the Second World War. She's seen some terrible Nazi atrocities in Europe, and she has come back to Sydney. And rather than kicking her heels and settling down to be a housewife, which is what the Australian government is telling her to do, she has taken over her father's private investigator's business and set herself up as Sydney's most infamous female detective. Like all good historical genre crime fiction, there's an element of truth there. There actually were female detectives in the US and Australia and Britain in the 1940s. Maybe not quite as sharp shooting as Billy Walker, but it's an amazing series. Listen to Tara. She has just got so much to say. And she is also an expert on the social perceptions of women in the 20th and 21st century, and has become a bestseller through her non-fiction work, which we discuss as well.
We'll make sure to link that episode in the podcast description and the video description on YouTube, as well as all the books that we mentioned today. Guys, that's all the time we have. Red, thank you so much for coming on. You're going to be here twice a month from now on. I'm super excited to have you as a regular contributor. We could talk about pickles or horse saddles, and I'd be happy to do that with you.
Well, I can't wait to come back on. It's been a delight chatting to you both, and well, thank you very much.
Of course. And Rhymes, you too. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for AMI audiobook review. If you're on YouTube, you can like and subscribe to our videos and our channel, and you can leave us a comment as well. We'll try to get to it on an upcoming episode. We're also available as a podcast if you'd rather listen to it in audio only. I'm Jacob Shamansky. This was AMI Audiobook Review. Have a good one.